How the Cold War still shapes NATO, Russia, and global tensions today. The Cold War was supposed to end with a wall coming down, with the Soviet Union collapsing, with a world finally free of nuclear fear, proxy wars, and ideological warfare. But the world didn't reset. It paused, shifted, and then resumed. Today, the shadows of the Cold War still shape our alliances, our enemies, and the global stage. Chapter 1: The Origins, NATO's birth and Soviet fears. After World War II, two superpowers emerged from the rubble, the United States and the Soviet Union, each with very different visions for the future. To contain Soviet influence in Europe, the West formed NATO in 1949, a military alliance built on the principle of collective defense. An attack on one would be an attack on all. In response, the Soviets formed their own alliance, the Warsaw Pact. And for decades, the world teetered between two blocs, locked in ideological and nuclear tension. This wasn't just a war of weapons, it was a war of ideas. Democracy versus communism. Capitalism versus central planning. The West versus the East. Proxy wars flared across the globe, from Korea to Vietnam, from Angola to Afghanistan, as each side tried to tip the balance of power in its favor without triggering a full-scale nuclear war. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction kept fingers off the trigger, but the arms race never stopped. Cities around the world held nuclear drills. Children learned to duck and cover. And the fear of annihilation loomed over everyday life. Espionage, propaganda, and surveillance became weapons of their own. Intelligence agencies like the CIA and KGB fought shadow wars across continents, toppling governments and backing secret operations, many of which would only come to light decades later. And all the while, the Iron Curtain held firm, dividing Europe, shaping alliances, and cementing the global order. But no empire lasts forever. And by the late 1980s, cracks were forming in the Eastern Bloc. Chapter 2: The Cold War ends. But not really. In 1991, the Cold War officially ended, or so it seemed. The Soviet Union collapsed. The Warsaw Pact dissolved. NATO, however, did not. Rather than disbanding, NATO expanded eastward into former Warsaw Pact and Soviet-aligned nations, starting with Germany's reunification and stretching through Poland, the Baltics, and ultimately up to the borders of Russia. To Western leaders, this expansion meant integration, stability, and democratic choice. But in the Kremlin, and for many Russians, it represented creeping encroachment on security and influence. After German reunification in 1990, Western officials reportedly provided verbal assurances that NATO would not expand eastward, but no binding written agreement ever existed. Historian Mary-Elise Surratt's research highlights how those informal assurances were never formalized, and that NATO enlargement officially began in the early 1990s, not long after the Soviet collapse. Starting in the early 1990s, Russian leaders, including President Boris Yeltsin, voiced strong concerns that NATO expansion violated the spirit of earlier agreements. During his 2007 speech in Munich, President Vladimir Putin accused the West of betrayal, claiming NATO's eastward advance was a calculated violation of promises made in the Cold War's last days. By the early 2000s, Russia viewed NATO's expansion as one of the main threats to its national security, arguing it reduced the flight time of potential Allied missiles to Moscow and posed a direct threat to its strategic buffer zones. NATO's eastward expansion didn't just redraw the map. It reshaped Russia's strategic mindset, cemented fears of Western encirclement, and helped fuel proxy wars like those in Georgia and Ukraine. It's also become central rhetoric in Moscow's narrative of historical grievance, the belief that diplomatic ambiguity and Western political ambition conspired to marginalize Russia in its own neighborhood. Chapter 3: Putin's rise and the revival of old rivalries. Russia's 1990s were chaotic, economically devastated and politically unstable. That vacuum paved the way for one man, Vladimir Putin. In the early 1990s, Russia transitioned abruptly from a centrally planned system to a market economy under Boris Yeltsin. Soviet-era price controls were lifted, state enterprises were privatized, and inflation skyrocketed. The economy collapsed, poverty surged, and political institutions were weak or fractured. A former KGB agent, Putin saw the post-Cold War world not as a reset, but as a betrayal. In 2005, he called the Soviet collapse the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. Putin has described the dissolution of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century, highlighting his deep sense of loss for a unified Russian state and historical continuity. He promised to restore Russian strength, influence, and dignity, and to push back against what he saw as Western overreach. After assuming power in 1999-2000, Putin moved to stabilize the federation, reassert centralized control, and rebuild economic and strategic strength, aided in part by rising oil revenues. He promoted a narrative of Russia's resurgence in response to perceived Western encroachment, especially through NATO expansion into what Moscow considers its near-abroad economic collapse. The reforms of the 1990s inflicted severe hardship, hyperinflation erased savings, institutions collapsed, and oligarchic elites emerged amid political chaos. Putin's core worldview. For Putin, the collapse was not just a political event, it was a moral and existential catastrophe that required correction through strong leadership and restored Russian influence. Strategic pushback. In speeches like his 2007 Munich address, Putin criticized what he saw as a unipolar world dominated by Western powers and affirmed Russia's right to defend its security against growing NATO encroachment. Chapter 4, Ukraine, the new front line. When Ukraine leaned west, Russia pushed back. Crimea was annexed in 2014. In 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion, citing NATO expansion and the threat of Western influence on its doorstep. In 2014, following Ukraine's pro-European Maidan uprising and ouster of pro-Russian President Yanukovych, Russia swiftly annexed Crimea and backed separatism in eastern Ukraine. Moscow claimed it was protecting its strategic interests, most notably the Black Sea Fleet base, and ethnic Russian populations, while blocking Ukraine's Western alignment. In 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion. Putin explicitly accused Ukraine of preparing for NATO membership, a security red line for Russia, and denounced NATO itself as a threat. He framed the invasion as necessary to defend Russian interests and expose Western aggression. To Moscow, this wasn't just about Ukraine. It was about rewriting the post-Cold War order. It was about survival in a world still defined by old rivalries. Russian leaders perceived NATO's 2008 declaration that Ukraine will become a member as a provocation, even though no formal membership timeline existed. Analysts argue this raised existential concerns in Moscow, intensifying Russian opposition to Ukraine's Western integration. Putin described the Soviet collapse, and the resulting loss of influence in Eastern Europe, as a catastrophe, framing NATO's growth into former Soviet zones as part of the same geopolitical betrayal he vowed to reverse. What unfolded in Ukraine thus mirrored Cold War logic: buffer zones, spheres of influence, proxy conflict, and messaging through force, reinforcing a mindset that Russia must assert dominance to preserve strategic depth in Europe. Geopolitical strategy. Ukraine's shift toward the West threatened Moscow's historical buffer and naval strategy centered on